Well, as a family, one of the things that Judy and I have enjoyed since we've been married is books. We love books, and our kids have also learned to love them as well, and our grandkids as well. And whenever the grandkids are over and stay overnight, we always make sure that we read a few stories to them, books to them. And one of the books that is always on the list is this beginner's Bible that we read. When we first started reading it to them, they just listened closely. Now they're getting to the point where they're reading it to us. And as I was reading through it today, or this morning, I realized that this book, this beginner's Bible, has really all the stories we've already looked at during the summer series. It's got the story of Abraham and Sarah as they're visited by God as they wait in that tent. It's got the story of Hagar. It's got the story of Jacob wrestling with that stranger in the middle of the night. The one thing this book doesn't have is the story we're going to look at today. This book doesn't have the story of Job. I looked real close. It's not here. It's probably a good thing it's not here, because this is a story for adults. This is not a story that's sugar-coated. This is a story for adults. So, with that in mind, this morning, before we started, I want to invite all of you to stand up for a moment. Just stand up where you are, just for a moment. Stand up, okay? And I want you to take your hands and do this. We're putting our big boy pants on today. Okay, got them on? You can be seated. This book is not easy to swallow, and it's not sugar-coated. But this is the truth about our lives. And so we're going to take a look at how Job meets the real God. Now, again, we've said this before, that sometimes lots of people want to meet God, and they have all kinds of images and ideas of what God's like, but the real God is the God we meet in the Bible. And one of the things we learn is that Job met that real God. In fact, he talks about that at the end of the book in chapter 42. He speaks about that in verse 5. Listen, he says, "My ears heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." In other words, what Job is saying, look, all these years I have believed in you. I have even with my ears heard you and obeyed you. But now finally, after all that I've been through, I have finally met you. I have had a real encounter with you. So what can we learn from Job about meeting that real God? What can we learn from him about that? Well, we're going to just walk through the story, and we'll have chances to see what God is saying throughout the whole experience of this book. Now, we're going to begin with the story itself, and then we'll hit the climax in chapter 42. But what we're going to learn is that when you meet the real God, it's more than just knowing about him, hearing about him. It's actually experiencing him. Now, if you do know anything about the book, you might know that it's got two parts to it. There's a frame story, as it's called, in chapters 1 and 2, and then at the end as well. And that frame tells a narrative, but in the middle, the rest of the book, the majority of the book, is this dialogue between Job and his friends and Job and God along the way. And so that's one of the things you have to know about how the kind of book is structured. Now, let's just begin with where it starts in chapter 1. We're told about this man, Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. So we know right from the beginning he is a godly man, an upright man. He fears God, and he's a righteous man. We're also told that he is a wealthy man. But God allows Satan, right from the very beginning, chapter 1, chapter 2, to test him. And when Satan says, I want to test this man, God says, well, you can do this, but you can't do that. You can have this kind of a test, but you can't do that. In other words, God always limits the extent to which he will allow that suffering to occur for Job. And that test begins with chapter 1, verse 13. In fact, let me just read this kind of story because it's just such a wondrous thing to hear what happened to him. Verse 13. One day, Job's sons and daughters were feasting, drinking wine at the oldest brother's house. A messenger came to Job and said, "The oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing nearby, and the Sabaeans attacked and made off with them. They put the servant to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, "The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties, swept down on your camels and made off with them. They put servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, yet another messenger came and said, "Your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house when suddenly a mighty wind swept in from the desert, struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on them, and they are all dead, and I am the only one to escape to tell you." So literally overnight, Job has lost everything. He's lost his wealth. He's lost his security. He's lost his children. He's lost his heirs. And his response to all that loss, verse 20, is this: Job got up, tore his robe, shaved his head, then he fell to the ground in worship and said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. Now, this is just, frankly, the first of a bunch of remarkable moments in the book, a remarkable response. See, Job ends up facing the loss in his life with this kind of clear-eyed realism. He realizes that he came into the world with nothing, not a stitch on him, naked. And he understands he will leave this same world the same way without anything. You can't take anything with you. And so he realizes that everything he has in the meantime, between that moment of birth to that moment of his death, all of it is a gift, a loan that's given to him. Now, if somebody loans you their car for, say, a few weeks, and then they come back to you and say, "So, that car I loaned you, I kind of need it back." What you almost certainly won't say is, "Well, why are you doing this to me? I've gotten used to having that car." We might say that, and sometimes we do say that when we have something given to us and we start thinking of it as our own. But what we ought to think, and what Job reminds us of, is that everything we're given is just this gift that we're given. And so, I was carless and you gave me a car, and I was naked and you clothed me. And he also says, as we sometimes sing and will, "You give and take away, you give and take away. Blessed be your name." So, got your big boy pants on still? That's the first thing. Everything's a gift. And God sometimes gives and sometimes takes away. Now, if the story ended there, just right there, if we would have just a wonderful story. It would be a spiritually insightful and profound story that everything we have is a gift. But it does not end there. Satan comes back, attacks him again, and this time does 2 things. First, he attacks his health. We're told Job was afflicted with all these sores, sat in that infamous ash pile with a shard of pottery in which he ends up scraping the sores. We're told he was afflicted, and this is just such vivid language, from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. But if that had been the end of the story, I think he still probably could have somehow still understood that God gives health and takes it away, that God's still God. But that's not the only gift he's given. He's also given not only that, but he's given the gift of 4 terrible friends, frankly. Now, I don't know. In fact, the text is somewhat ambiguous about this. Do these friends come from God or do they come from Satan? It's hard to know, especially in light of what they have to say to him. But they come to him, and they each have their own take on why Job is suffering. And each of them is wrong. But let's take a look at what they have to say. What others say about Job's suffering. First, it's his wife. That's one of the 4 terrible counselors. She comes to him in verse 9 and says, "Are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die." So, this God is come on, you finally found what he's made out of, what color he is, what stripes he has. And he's an evil God, a bad God. So curse him and let him destroy you. But at least you've had the last word. So that's what she says. To which he says, verse 10, "You are talking like a foolish woman." Now, notice he doesn't say you are a foolish woman. That's never a wise thing to say to your spouse, is it? I mean, he says, I've known some foolish women over the years, and you right now are acting similarly to them. And so it's kind of a great bit of discretion in how he speaks, and frankly, a lot of self-control when he hears these words. But her viewpoint, Job's wife's viewpoint, is simply, God's the one who's wicked, so blame him and then die. Let him strike you down. And so that's the first perspective. Job's wife says, God is wicked, blame him. But then these 3 not so great friends show up, Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar. And they say it in lots of different ways, but here's a good example of it in chapter 4, verse 7. "Consider now, who being innocent has ever perished? Where were the upright ever destroyed? Since you're the one that's suffering, you must be the wicked one, Job. God would never allow this suffering unless you are guilty of some horrific sin. So repent, Job." So see, his wife has said, God's the one who's wicked, blame him. His friends are saying, you're the one that's wicked, Job, blame yourself. To which Job, he just frankly goes ballistic. And from chapter 4 all the way through chapter 37, there's this back and forth between Job and each of these friends. Each of the 3 friends will speak, then Job will respond. Goes around 3 cycles along the way. And during that, Job says a couple key things over and over again. The first thing he does, he keeps crying out, is kind of sets the stage in chapter 3, verse 1. Listen, after this, Job opened his mouth, cursed the day he was born, said, "So may the day of my birth perish, and the night it was said, a son is born. That day may it turn to darkness. May God above not care about it. May no light shine upon it." What Job goes on to say is that I suffer innocently. I am an innocent sufferer. I am a righteous person, and yet I'm suffering. I'm not suffering because I've sinned. I'm suffering just because I'm righteous. And so that's one of the themes that he keeps saying over and over. I am righteous. I have not sinned. And that's, by the way, the first blank. I am an innocent sufferer. Again and again, he protests with those words. The second thing he keeps saying is this: God won't talk to me. He's cut me off. Look, verse 3, chapter 23. "If only I knew where to find him. If only I could go to his dwelling. I would state my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would find out what he would answer. I would find out that he would answer me and consider what he would say." So Job is saying over and over again, I'm an innocent sufferer, and I've been cut off from God. I can't make my case. I can't find him to make my case. And that's a second blank. I've been cut off from God. So he keeps trying, screaming, sometimes getting very close to blasphemy, demanding that God come and appear to him so that God can explain himself. And finally, we realize that God shows up in chapter 38, where God appears in this great storm or great whirlwind. And then this is when we have a problem. See, Job has been suffering terribly. He's gone on and on about it. And the first thing God does not do when he shows up is he doesn't give an explanation for why all this has happened to Job. He doesn't defend himself. Now, what we know as the readers to this book is that there are some other things that have happened in heaven that Job doesn't know about. We know from chapters 1 and 2 that all of this has come as a test. But Job doesn't know this is a test. I mean, if he knew it was a test, he could hang in there better. See, if you know the purpose of it all, it's a test, well, you can hang in there. Job doesn't know it's a test. He's just suffering through it in what feels like a meaningless kind of a way. God shows up. And he offers absolutely no explanation for what is happening. He doesn't tell him why this has happened to him. In fact, the truth is, rather than defend himself, God goes after Job. And he begins to attack him, or not attack, but at least question him, put him on the stand and cross-examine him. And question after question come, and here's a typical kind of sense of them from chapter 38. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Boy, this is dripping in sarcasm. Who marked its dimensions? Or what were its footing sets? Or on what were its footing sets? Or who laid its cornerstone while the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy? Who shut up the sea behind doors when it burst forth from the womb, when I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness, when I set its limits for it and set its doors and bars in place, when I said, this far you may come and no farther, here is where your proud waves halt. Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades or loosen Orion's belt? Can you bring forth the constellations in their season or lead out the bear with its cubs? Do you know the laws of the heavens? Can you set up God's dominion over the earth? Can you raise your voice to the clouds and cover yourself with a flood of water? Do you send the lightning bolts on their way? Do they report to you? Here we are. See, question after question after question, God peppers him with all of these. And to each of the questions, Job's answer is either, I don't know, or beats me. And yet God keeps throwing these questions at him. And what God is finally saying to Job is just this: Job, you don't even know how to run the physical universe. So why in the world are you trying to tell me how to run the moral universe? And so question after question, finally, after 2 chapters, Job speaks. Verse 3, chapter 40. Then Job answered the Lord, I am unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. And so Job finally is so humbled by this whole thing that he just is speechless before God. But it's not because God has given him the answers. God has not given him any answers. And so here's the first thing about what Job learns is God offers Job no explanations. And just about the time you think that, okay, God has had enough of getting into the hide of Job, he goes on. You got your good boy pants on still? Here we go. I'm not finished, he says, God says. Would you discredit my justice? Would you condemn me to justify yourself? Try your own hand at justice, Job, God says. Unleash the fury of your wrath. Look at all who are proud and bring them low. Look at all who are proud and humble them. Crush the wicked where they stand. Bury them in all the dust together. Shroud their faces in the grave, when I myself will admit to you that your right hand can save you. See, God gives no explanation and no comfort. See, we tend to think that Job is putting God on trial. The truth is, this book is all about the fact that God is putting Job on trial. And all Job can do is kind of stammer and stutter and shrug. I don't report to you, God says. Not only don't you understand my questions if I ask them, you don't even know the right questions to ask. And so God offers Job not only no explanation, he offers Job no comfort. And yet, while God feels no need to defend himself, what's striking is that Job is utterly changed by this moment of encountering him. Verse 3 chapter 43. Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. My ears had heard of you, now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. See, all the turbulence and all the anger and all the outrage and the rage has finally dissipated. All that pride has been humbled, and Job is changed. Now, when you first read it, it seems like God has done all the wrong things. He's offered no explanations, no comfort, and yet the truth is Job is changed forever. In fact, you see that in how God begins to talk to Job. He keeps calling him finally now his servant. In fact, look at verse 7, chapter 42. He's talking to the three unreliable, not so helpful friends. He says to them, I am angry with you and your two friends because you have not spoken the truth about me as my servant Job has. So now take 7 bulls, 7 rams, go to my servant Job, sacrifice a burnt offering for yourselves. My servant Job will pray for you, and I will accept his prayer and not deal with you according to your folly. You have not spoken the truth about me as my servant Job has. 4 times in 2 verses there, God calls Job his servant. Now, what's that all about? Well, it reminds us that while God offers no explanation and provides Job with no comfort, still, Job has realized who God really is. And we, reading it today, realize who God finally is. First of all, some people think God is all good but not powerful. Others say he's all powerful, but we're not so sure he's good. But what this book shows us is that God is both good and powerful, because nothing comes into Job's life that's not part of God's plan. On the one hand, God puts limits on what Satan can do. That's clear from the very beginning. God says, Satan, you can test him, but you can only go this far. God will not let evil be unleashed infinitely. He hates it. He will let it run its course, but he won't allow it to overwhelm and destroy. But when evil comes, we see God has a purpose for his children when they suffer. In fact, that's the first blank there. When you suffer, remember God has a purpose in it. What God is saying to Job is, Job, one of the reasons that you have such difficulty is that you assume that you can understand all the reasons why you suffer. But how can you expect to understand everything? I mean, you don't understand the lightning and the snow and the foundations of the world. How can you be so presumptuous to think that you can understand the mind of God? That seems harsh, but after going through this, Job gets this. He understands that a lot of the reasons he's miserable is that he keeps demanding that God explain himself. C.S. Lewis once wrote this. The ancient folks approach God or the gods as the accused face the judge. For the moderns, the roles are reversed. We're the judge, or think we are, and God is in the dock. He's the defendant. We will be very reasonable judges if God is simply willing to give us a reasonable explanation for why he permits all these evils to occur. We are all ears. We're ready to listen, and we will be very reasonable judges. We might even be willing to acquit God if the explanation is reasonable. But the point is, we start out today assuming that's the order of things. We are on the bench. We're the judge. God is in the dock. He's the defendant. Now, it's either one or the other. I mean, it really is either one or the other. Either we are on the bench and God is in the dock, or God is on the bench and we are in the dock. There's not a middle ground here. And if you want to be miserable, put God in the dock and keep demanding that he explain why he does the things he does. Keep doing that, and you will find yourself filled with misery and disappointment because you can't understand all of those things. Now, is that hard to swallow? Yes, it's hard to swallow. When you're the one that's going through all that agony and brokenness and tears, those are hard things to understand and accept. That's where you need your big boy pants on, right? But what Job is saying is, when you suffer, listen to God himself. He said, listen to me now, and I will speak. I will question you, and you shall answer me. And then when suffering comes, God seems to be saying to us, so now we're going to find out why you really are someone that follows me. See, what Satan has said is, does Job fear God for nothing? You've put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has. You've blessed the works of his hands so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse your face. What Satan is saying is, well, of course Job follows you, God, because of all the things you give him. You give him wealth and health and security. You're just a sugar daddy for him. Why wouldn't he follow you? But you take away those things, and then you'll find out what the score is really like. But see, when suffering comes, God is saying this to us. Now we will see whether you are in this to serve you or to serve me. See, until suffering comes, we can't really know for sure. Are we in this because we've been blessed? But when we lose those things, it forces us to ask the question, so is that the reason we followed God? And what he wants to say is, I'm God. Do you follow me because I'm God? Or because I give you all these things you too often make too important in your life? And so what God is saying here is, be tough on yourself. Realize that sometimes the suffering forces you to ask the question, have you gotten too much attached to the things that are so important to you? And so that's the second thing we have to understand. When you suffer, listen to God himself. And the last thing we can learn from this as a foundational lesson is, when we suffer, look to the one whom Job points to. See, remember how it was that Job declared, I am an innocent sufferer. I am an innocent sufferer. To which we have to say, no, Job, you're not an innocent sufferer. I mean, you're just not. There's only one who was afflicted and never deserved it. There's only one, and he hasn't yet been born. Remember how often Job said, I've been cut off from God. No, Job, you don't know. You don't know what it's like to be cut off from God when you are truly innocent, when you love God with all your heart, when you followed him your entire life, and then in the middle of your own execution, he turns his back on you. You don't know until you know what that's like. See, the two things that Job insisted were true were not true of him. They would be true, but they would be true of someone else. And so that at the end, God would say this about Job's three foolish friends. He'd say, my servant Job, this is chapter 42, verse 8, my servant Job will pray for you, and I will accept his prayer and not deal with you according to your folly. That promise was fulfilled by, the greater Job, the one who was the truly righteous sufferer, who on a cross was truly cut off from God. And we just at times feel like we're cut off from God because we define our relationship so often by whether God is serving our purposes. And so when we don't have everything we'd like, when he's not at our beck and call, we feel cut off. But Jesus really was cut off. Served God his whole life, only to have God turn his back at the moment he needed him most. And so, one of the things we have to understand is that Job suffered, but he wasn't the righteous sufferer. He was the one that points to the righteous sufferer. Verse 23, verse 3 says, if only I knew where to find him, if only I could go to his dwelling. See, what's striking is that God at the end says, Job, you are my servant. And yet when you look at how Job responds, he does all these things that we scratch our head at. I mean, he's ready to curse God. He curses the day he was born. He accuses God of injustice. He rants and raves against God. He comes very close to blasphemy. He's filled with self-pity all along, but he does one thing that's right. And the one thing he does right is that he brings all of his suffering, he brings all of his pain, he brings it to God. See, Job found meaning in his suffering because he never stopped bringing it to God. He never stopped praying. He found the meaning of his suffering because he never gave up talking to God about it. And that's our answer too. When we find ourselves suffering, when we find ourselves full of all kinds of questions about why the things that are happening to us, we don't get all the answers, but we have someone we can bring into our presence and allow him to be present with us. And so what Job is reminding us to do is to keep on praying, keep going after God, keep bringing all those hurts and pains to him, even though you don't understand why you go through what you go through. In some ways, I'm struck by the irony of this story. There's probably, I'm sure, no one in the Bible that suffers more than Job, other than Jesus himself. And yet, when Job was in the middle of all that he lost, he certainly scratched his head and wondered, God, why are you doing all this? What is the purpose behind all of this? And in the middle of all that, he never got the answer. God never gave him the explanation. God never gave him the comfort. But now 2,000, 3,000 years later, when millions of people around the world and throughout the centuries, when they go through suffering, whose life is it that brings them hope? Whose life is it that gives them the assurance that God will still be with them in the end? It's the story of Job. He didn't know that at the time. See, that's how it almost always is for us. We go through these questions and these struggles in life. We don't understand the meaning at the moment, only later, maybe not till eternity. Then we see how God has used that, how he doesn't waste anything, how he continues to be at work. And in the meantime, what we need to do is keep praying, keep sharing those moments of brokenness and pain with him, letting him know what you're going through. And that's why so many of the Psalms are Psalms that David writes in the middle of anguish and confusion. And God honors that in Job. That's the good thing about what you did right, Job. Keep doing that. When we finally realize it, we'll come to the point of knowing God. Not just about him, but knowing him. So it's in the suffering that we're humbled. In the suffering, we understand who we really are. And that's when we finally discover who God really is as well. My eyes had heard of you, but now, my ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. And so when we find ourselves suffering, bring those things to the Lord. Let's pray. Father, we're grateful for the story of Job and what he can teach us, continues to teach us, has taught millions before us about facing the sufferings of life. How so often life brings and takes things away, and yet you are still God. And when we finally let you be God in all the chapters of our life, we find peace, we find purpose, we find a sense of gratitude. Give us that today in Jesus' name. Amen.